Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing the sad rise of Jew hatred in the UK and also sharing one woman's hideous anti-Semitic attack, and this is her story. Well, welcome to the programme, and my guest today is all the way from North London, and a good friend of mine, Sharon Klaff from Campaign for Truth. Welcome to the programme.
Hi Simon, thank you for having me.
Pleasure. I know that you've been on a few of the programmes and you've been on the Middle East Report before, but can you remind our viewers of your background, because you're from South Africa originally. What was life like growing up being Jewish in South Africa?
Okay, so I grew up in apartheid South Africa. And apartheid is a topic that's very much discussed today, and I think it's misunderstood. Apartheid means separateness. So I grew up in an environment where different ethnic groups within South Africa were separate and they weren't allowed to mix. So there was me as part of the so-called white community, and we weren't allowed to live amongst or live with anybody who came from Black, Indian, Asian, anything like that. We weren't allowed to socialize with them. So, and you grew up like that because you lived there. You were kind of, you accepted that as a status quo. But as you grew up, you began to notice, for instance, that the woman who worked in our house, who was my nanny, so to speak, we played with her children, but we played with them behind the scenes. Her daughter used to come to our house, but wasn't allowed to be seen to be in our house. And during school time, she was sent back to the farm to be with her family, and her mother would stay not in our home, but in special rooms that were built for the people who worked in homes. So you lived with that kind of separate environment. In that, unspoken about was the divide between the various so-called white groups, and I guess that happened amongst the black groups as well and the Indian groups. So you had the English, we called them the English, which meant British. You had the Afrikaners, you had within that Jews, Christians, and those were the two main religions. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism as I grew up, overt anti-Semitism. And the South Africa was part of British colony, but it was also had a big German influence. Southwest Africa was German, and so there were black shirts, and my father in his youth was involved in that, which is how he came into Zionist politics. When I grew up, my brother was called also to start fighting against the Nazis or protecting us against the Nazis. So this was the environment we grew up in, of a separateness of colour divide and a separateness of ethnic divide within each grouping.
And how did you end up coming to the UK?
By default, actually. I got married and I came on an extended working holiday with my new husband. But when we came by boat, in those days people travelled on a boat more than an aeroplane. We came on a boat, took 12 days on the high seas, which was quite awful. And so we arrived here, and when we got off this boat, I think I sensed the freedom that I'd never felt in my life before. And within months I knew that I would never go back to South Africa, that I would never want to live in a society that was restricting in that way. So we stayed, and it took us about 30 years to realise we weren't on holiday anymore and to settle properly.
You're an integral part of the Jewish community in North London. When did you start to see that climate of anti-Semitism start to rise? And when did you experience that?
I have always been pro-Israel Zionist. I grew up in that environment. When I came here, I didn't join particularly any community, but around about the 1980s, I guess there were some wars in Israel and so on, and I began to realize that the same pattern was erupting, that there was beginning to be a change. I remember 1967 war very clearly. I was in South Africa, and as a Jew, once the 6 days were over, we were praised for winning the war, even though we weren't there. And there was a kind of admiration for Israel. And I realized in the 80s that was beginning to change. Perhaps with the change of governments in Israel, from Labour to more right-wing governments. I think that might have been what changed the flavors. So, for instance, the Histadrut, which is the union movement in Israel, was very aligned here in the UK with the unions. And there was great support between them. And that support, I think, began to wither away sometime in the 80s. And I began to notice a change of feeling. But if I go into the 1990s, the thing that definitely earmarked it for me was the film called The Pianist. And I've spoken about this a lot. I've probably told you about it before, where I didn't know what I was going to watch. And it was the most prickly film I ever saw. It was about the Polish pianist during the war and the devastation. It was an evocation of war. And when I came out of that, I was sobbing. I was sobbing from my soul. Not so much because of what happened, but because that was the moment I realized that it was happening again. And I was asking myself, how do I protect my children? And I think that's the defining moment when I decided to change from just letter writing and being at home trying to lobby people to actually going on the streets and becoming an activist.
What made you really decide to be an activist? Why did you want to take this into your own hands and say enough's enough, and then suddenly, get involved in kind of pro-Israel activities and get involved in street demonstrations and other work that you've done? Okay,
so I had always written. I used to be published quite a lot particularly in the Daily Mail. That defining moment of that film really spoke to me, and I had spent my life trying to work out how the Holocaust happened. What was it in society that allowed a seemingly democratic elected government to change in less than, 7 years, to become this murderous Nazi regime? And I could never find answers to it. And I began to feel that this sense was growing again. And so I looked for somewhere to go to find like-minded people. And I'd heard about protests outside the Ahava store. Ahava is an Israeli cosmetic company. And so I went to join them. I went along there and I found like-minded people there who I'm still friendly with, still work with. And so I used to go every 2 weeks to those protests where we found the very early BDS, which is the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Group. There were only about 50 of them on the streets. And we used to stand and oppose them outside the store. That's really what took me into I didn't realize I was an activist until somebody asked me to write an article about activism, and then that's when I started thinking about it.
Fabulous. So to put this in context, let's go to this excellent video produced by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, talking about the mutation of anti-Semitism to see where we are today.
Within living memory of the Holocaust, after which the world said it would never happen again, anti-Semitism has returned. But what is anti-Semitism, and why should its return be cause for grave concern, not only for Jews, but for all of us? Historically, anti-Semitism has been hard to define because it expresses itself in such contradictory ways. Before the Holocaust, Jews were hated because they were poor and because they were rich, because they were communists and because they were capitalists, because they kept to themselves and because they infiltrated everywhere, because they clung to ancient religious beliefs, and because they were rootless cosmopolitans who believed nothing. So what is anti-Semitism? Let's be clear, not liking people because they're different isn't anti-Semitism, it's xenophobia. Criticizing Israel isn't anti-Semitism. It's part of the democratic process and Israel is a democracy. Anti-Semitism is something much more dangerous. It means persecuting Jews and denying them the right to exist collectively as Jews with the same rights as everyone else. It's a prejudice that, like a virus, has survived over time by mutating. So in the Middle Ages, Jews were persecuted because of their religion. In the 19th and 20th centuries, they were reviled because of their race. Today, Jews are attacked because of the existence of their nation-state, Israel. Denying Israel's right to exist is the new anti-Semitism. And just as anti-Semitism has mutated, so has its legitimation. Each time, as the persecution descended into barbarity, the persecutors reached for the highest form of justification available. In the Middle Ages, it was religion. In post-Enlightenment Europe, it was science, the so-called scientific study of race. Today, it's human rights. Whenever you hear human rights invoked to deny Israel's right to exist, you are hearing the new anti-Semitism. So, why has it returned? There are many reasons, but one root cause is the cognitive failure called scapegoating. When bad things happen to a group, its members can ask one of two questions: what did we do wrong? Or who did this to us? The entire fate of the group will depend on which it chooses. If it asks, what did we do wrong? It has begun the process of healing the harm. But if instead it asks, who did this to us? It's defined itself as a victim. It will then seek a scapegoat to blame for all its problems. Classically, this has been the Jews, because for 1,000 years they were the most conspicuous non-Christian minority in Europe, and today, because Israel is the most conspicuous non-Muslim country in the Middle East. The argument is always the same. We are innocent, therefore they are guilty. Therefore, if we are to be free, they, the Jews or the State of Israel, must be destroyed. That is how the great evils begin. Why then should we all care about this? After all, if we're not Jewish, what has it got to do with us? The answer is that anti-Semitism is about the inability of a group to make space for difference. And because we're all different, the hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. It wasn't Jews alone who suffered under Hitler. It wasn't Jews alone who suffered under Stalin. It isn't Jews alone who suffer under the radical Islamists and others who deny Israel's right to exist. Anti-Semitism is the world's most reliable early warning sign of a major threat to freedom, humanity, and the dignity of difference. It matters to all of us, which is why we must fight it together.
Absolutely fantastic explanation of what is anti-Semitism and how it manifests itself and where we are today with the rise of Jew hatred. Before we talk about the a brutal anti-Semitic attack that you suffered last October, Sharon, can you tell us a little bit more about Campaign for Truth and some of the rallies that you organised and the work you're involved in that would encourage some of our viewers?
Okay, so Campaign for Truth arose out of those demonstrations outside the Hava store. There were a group of us who realized that we weren't organized. We didn't really bring a message. We brought the idea that we were Jewish, and we brought the idea that Israel existed, but we didn't really have a message. When we looked across at the opponents, they had everything organized. They had a name. They were the BDS. They had ostensibly a country called Palestine, and they had an expression of desire. What they said was, Palestine must be free from the river to the sea. So if you were a passerby and you walked past this, you would say to yourself, over there we can see what they want. There's a country called Palestine somewhere, and these people are fighting for its freedom. And who are these people with the blue and white flags? What's their message? Nothing. We didn't have a billboard, we didn't have a poster, we didn't have a logo, we just had the Israeli flag. So we really didn't bring a message except our objection to the increasing anti-Semitism against the collective, which is Israel, the Jewish collective. So a group of us tried to do this, and we decided to form an organization that was not party to any particular ideology or religion. So we called it Campaign for Truth because we realized that the propaganda that was coming out of that pro-Palestinian side needed to be combated. So we started Campaign for Truth, and we started with a single mission, and that was to express what Hamas was and why people should notice that Hamas was a pernicious organization and not a friendly charity as it set out to be. And we started with that. We started getting signatures and petitions and so on. And from there, we started going to the bigger demonstrations. At that time, there was the March on Jerusalem, and they started with the Mavi Marmara. Do you remember the boat that went to Israel?
Yes. Yeah,
Going to Gaza and so on. With Ken O'Keefe, there was Jenny Tong, and Corbyn was a big speaker at all these events. So we started going to them, and there was an interesting demographic at these protests, and this, I think, it pertains to where we're going with our discussion. The demographic was very much a left-leaning, pro-Corbyn aspect, and coupled with it were sort of a Middle Eastern, not even a religious Islamic grouping. There were people from Egypt, there were people from the more secular countries in the Middle East. And they were amassing in large numbers, and there were just a few of us, with some of the Christians, with people from Wales, and some of the Christians used to stand with us. So we used to go to those meetings, and they were there was sort of them with their loudspeakers, and there was us, but there wasn't really a big violence between us. And we then. What happened with that organization was two of the guys who started it with me moved on, had young babies and families and moved on. And so I kind of just kept it as a Facebook site until 2014, when the neo-Nazis threatened to march on Golders Green. And I revamped it then, and I made it very much a Jewish organization, and we started holding events. You may remember our big BBC Watch event that we held with a huge audience. And we started inviting people to speak, because people were not coming to England and talking from our perspective. There was very much the left-wing perspective, but not the more Zionist grouping that would come to the UK.
And so, Sharon, share with us how the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, because he was the president of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, has really changed the climate in terms of really escalating this rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing across Britain today.
Okay, so Jeremy Corbyn, as you know, was a backbencher, and people considered him to be a little bit out there. They didn't pay much attention to him, but we knew him. We had seen him on those platforms opposite the embassy with the Hezbollah flags behind him. You've seen the famous photographs of Jeremy Corbyn with the Hezbollah flag behind him. We knew what he was up to. We had, amongst our group was a chap called Richard Millett, who used to film the meetings. And so he has a huge archive of all the sort of older Jeremy Corbyn speeches and talks and participation in anti-Israel events. So, but the greater population ignored him. He was just considered some crazy left-wing guy. And during Tony Blair's as MP, he had removed the left-wing element from the Labour Party. So Corbyn was left there on the backbenches, and nobody expected him to arise again. Giving him that power to be a leader has made him into a sort of cult figure. What the current generation don't know is where he came from, and this is what's coming out now in the media, but they don't seem to mind. We run a Facebook page called Jeremy Corbyn Watch, and on that page we see that we have a massive, massive response to the things that we post about Corbyn. But when we post something about anti-Semitism, we don't get a huge response. We sometimes get 1 million viewers on an article. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, there's not much interest in it. So I think the general population is really not as interested in anti-Semitism as we are.
Now, I want to share now the kind of details of the attack you experienced, because I was actually in the Israeli Knesset doing an interview with a good friend of yours who you introduced me to this program, Likud member of Knesset, Meir Hana, and I got a news alert on my phone come through that a Jewish woman had been attacked in North London at a pro-Jeremy Corbyn event. So it was a shocker. I read it, and then I then discovered that you were the victim in that attack, which was even more shocking. Can you share with us what happened at this event? It was entitled Corbyn, Anti-Semitism and Justice for Palestine, that occurred on Tuesday, the 16th of October, 2018.
Okay, so when the Labour Party was considering whether to adopt the definition of anti-Semitism, they developed a group of more left-thinking people within the Labour Party trying to stop Jeremy Corbyn from adopting this definition. And they were holding meetings across the country, and this was the second such meeting in London. And it's a meeting that was brought together by Stop the War Coalition, the PSC, Workers' Revolutionary Party. All of these people came together to ostensibly stop him doing this. But we knew that inside they were actually being quite extensively anti-Semitic. We had already been barred from going to the first one at Conway Hall, where I was attacked, where I found a booklet about Zionism that had a cover of a swastika with a Magen David on it. And this chap gave it to me, but didn't tell me he was selling it. So he wanted it back from me. And when I said, no, I need to keep it because it's evidence of what these people are up to, he put his arm around my neck and tried to grab me. And you've got a video of that.
Yeah, and we got the footage of that now. So let's have a look at this footage.
I don't think that's a bit offensive to Jews.
No, I'm Jewish myself.
It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or not. There were Jews that killed Jews in the Inquisition. There were Jews that killed Jews in the Holocaust. Your Jewish lineage doesn't mean that that's not anti-Semitic.
There were Jews who, by virtue of being Zionists, killed very many Jews.
So can I ask you, do you not think it's insensitive for Jews that have lost family in the Holocaust to create a logo like that, taking a Jewish symbol
No, I don't.
and putting a swastika in?
No, I don't. I think it's an accurate description. Give me that back, please.
Can I have my shoe? Can I have my shoe?
I have
please?
nothing to do with your shoe.
Can I
Give me
have my
that
shoe,
back.
please?
Give me that back. Give me that back immediately. No, I didn't. You stole it.
Yep, that's Father Christmas putting a Jewish lady in a headlock.
Don't touch me!
What are you doing?
I know. Carry on, John.
So, yeah, so you see I described to you when I first went on these demos that there was just a lot of noise and shouting, and you can see that since 2014, we're now 5 years later, and this is what it's developed to. It's becoming more violent. It's becoming increasingly difficult to express your views as a Zionist and Jewish person. So that's what happened to me at Conway Hall. The police were called and took away the pamphlet, but we've never heard back from them, and they refused to act against this chap, even though there were witnesses and a film to show what they did. So we fast forward to the 16th of October, which was a difficult time for me, so forgive me if I take my time in talking about
absolutely.
it. That night was the second of the meetings, and my colleague Ambrosine from Iron Anti-Semitism had a ticket to go in. I didn't have a ticket to go in because I teach, and I knew that I'd get there late, but she had a ticket to go in. And I said I would come there and see if I could get in on the night. And when I got there, I found that she'd been removed from the meeting and was outside. So when this happens, when they don't let us into meetings to witness what they're talking about, we protest. We protest because we want to bring attention of the public that's passing by to see what's going on. So we protested, and when you protest, you make a noise, for sure. So while this was going on, I had decided I was going home. I had my phone in my pocket, and I had thought, okay, I'm going home. I've had enough of this. You know, you kind of get filled up with this idea that you have to always express what you feel about this racism that's directed at you. So as I was going to go, I realized that somebody was attacking Ambrosine. I didn't know that she was busy kicking her shins quite violently, but I saw this grab for her phone and the noise and the shouting. So, and I realized this was going to be very violent. So I put my hand in my pocket, took my phone, and in my panic, I couldn't open my phone. I wanted to call the police. And while I was doing that, this girl turned her attention on me. And she grabbed me by the hair here and pulled me along the pavement. And at some stage, took my phone. I can't say exactly when, but my phone was gone. And when she let me go, I realized my phone was gone. So very probably stupidly, I ran after her to get my phone back from her, which is when she grabbed me by the hair again, and she dragged me down the pavement, away from the crowd. And of the videos I've got, it was a very dark night, so the videos are really quite a mush.
Yep.
Can I use the word mush?
Yeah, can we use the word mush?
And so she dragged me down the pavement and was beating my head on the floor, using my hair like a whip, beating and beating my head on the floor. And then she started kicking me in the temple. And then I passed out. And I came round with a friend calling my name and a policeman. And what can I say? That's what happened to me. And, yeah, excuse me. So when you've been beaten in the head, you become a little bit disorientated. When I finally stood up, I found that there were masses of police there. There were about 40 policemen. And they weren't paying any attention to what had happened. They said, the inspector told me that his job was to escort the people who'd been in the meeting out safely, as though we were the violent people. They didn't come with me to hospital. The ambulance didn't turn up. I had to be taken by a friend. I never got called afterwards for interview. The police were completely remiss. And when I chased it up after a couple of days, they didn't even have a report because the policeman had misspelt my name. So right through this, the police weren't very helpful, which makes me feel very vulnerable. I don't know what else to say to you. It really is, to be kicked in the head like that violently is quite disturbing.
It's vile and it's disgusting, and you know, you don't imagine that something would actually take place. But can you share with us the type of people that were attending this meeting in defence of Corbyn?
Okay. So inside the meeting, from what I can get, and I saw them walking out before I went to hospital, were the usual people that we know from these pro-Corbyn meetings, from the BDS meetings. And we recognise some of them. I don't know all their names, but you recognise some of them. There's, there's a lady who runs Jewish Voice for Labour, is a lady called Naomi Idrisi Wimborne, or Wimborne Idrisi. She wasn't there, but this was the kind of grouping, the Jewish grouping that was there, this pro-Corbyn, anti-Israel, Labour-supporting members of the Jewish community. They were there, the usual BDS types, left-wing human rights activists, probably ex-CND people, or those sort of activists that we always find on the streets when there's something going on. I saw some of them today doing the climate change stuff with all their banners and so on. So that sort of person. And then outside were the wardens, and we know the wardens because we've seen them before at the meetings. We can identify them. We don't know their names, but we know them, and we know they're part of Workers' Revolutionary Party. So the one warden, just going back over the video and getting memory and witness statements, it's becoming clearer to us that the attackers were called in. That's our view, that the wardens had called, or somebody in the meeting had called these attackers in to target us. That's very much our sense.
Sharon, what were your concerns? I mean, did you fear that by trying to get into this meeting that this could result in abuse or this could result in a physical attack? And also, what were they trying to hide then if they were wanting to teach you and your friend a lesson?
Okay, so as you know, Simon, I sit, Ambrosine and I, we work together, we sit more to the right of the political spectrum. We support Likud in Israel, we support Bibi Netanyahu. I am not a socialist and have never been a socialist, not for any reason other than I don't believe in socialism. So apart from Corbyn, I would never be on that side of the political divide. But in a democracy, I'm entitled to be that. But increasingly, because of the stand that we take, we are being termed the racists, the alt-right, the white supremacists. Because we out anti-Semitism, we are called Islamophobic. And this is an interesting topic of today, that to talk about anti-Semitism, you're now talking about Jews who are white. We're categorized as white. And if you're white, you don't experience racism. And so if we talk about anti-Semitism, it's very clear that the majority of anti-Semitism today comes from the Islamic communities and Islamic states. We're not talking about Muslim people, we're talking about ideology. And if we say that, we become Islamophobic. Nobody will want to hear what we've got to say, but we become Islamophobic and we get labeled. And I think we're being attacked for that. There's a tweet that I discovered, and because recently some of our activists have been set up, and there's going to be a big issue about it. But the tweet I discovered has said something like they've dealt with the majority of the Jewish community. In other words, they've mollified them, and there's just a few activists left that have to be dealt with. I'm using the word dealt with, but have to be attended to. That the few activists are the problem. And the few activists are myself and my little group. And I think that we're being targeted.
But are you, in light of the brutal attack that you received at the hands of these Jeremy Corbyn supporters, and obviously clearly the hardcore extremist far left wing within his party and within his support within the Labour Party, is a concern that those that support Jeremy Corbyn, that underpin his main support base, are essentially violent thugs? Would that be a correct analysis to portray? Or is there a violent element within his core support base?
I think it's a very thin line that we have to tread here. Absolutely. I would never say that Jeremy Corbyn is a violent person. He's clearly not a violent person. And I don't think he advocates violence. But unfortunately, the company that he keeps, when he talks about Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends, that becomes the problem. And you always get, when you sit on a platform like that, you always get followers that come from behind. And it's those followers who perhaps don't know the history, don't know what has led us to this kind of political divide, but are subject to the sound bites of propaganda. And those are the dangerous people. So what we have is what Rabbi Sachs spoke about. We have a hijacking going on. We have a hijacking, particularly of the word human rights. If you label yourself as a human rights organization and you talk about human rights and freedom and so on, you become good. If you talk about Islamic anti-Semitism, you become bad. So there's this hijacking of human rights, and there's a kind of notion of that where we're called the fascists. The fascists are really the people who are using human rights to stop us being and believing what we believe in. So there's a kind of totalitarian element. And again, that goes back to Rabbi Sachs when we talk about what is it about anti-Semitism and Jews being the scapegoat. There's a recipe for events like the Holocaust. You need a totalitarian leader and you need a scapegoat. That's all you need. So we have the handy Jew, and we're increasingly getting a totalitarian attitude in our country, which is a huge problem. And a totalitarian attitude because we've got a Labour Party that says, if you don't believe what we want you to believe, we have ways and means of making you believe it. And we're the target because we speak out against it.
And I know that in the aftermath of the attack, the day later, this was taken up by all of the Jewish press, Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News, also covered by the Daily Mail as well. Because this became a kind of big story, did it have a knock-on effect on our parliamentarians and others that were shocked that something like this could have actually happened in our country?
It was taken up by a lot of the press. It was taken up by the Sunday Times, the Sun, Daily Mail. It was in the newspapers in Australia, in Canada. I had phone calls from across the world wishing me well. So this was a story that spread very widely. My MP became involved because I asked for his help. I need to correct myself. My phone was stolen. I believe I got a message from my MP, but to my stolen phone, so I never really received the message. So did anybody speak about it in the House of Commons? No, I don't think so. Did anybody speak about it at our Jewish Board of Deputy meetings? Definitely not. They were asked about it and they stepped aside, even though they make statements about all sorts of things. So the support I got came from the general public and from one or two journalists and people like yourself, who are our friends. But no, there's been no knock-on effect from it. There's been very little recognition that there is a violence on our streets. I have been attacked 3 times. This is my 3rd time. The very first time was outside the Palestine Expo, where once again the police were involved. I have video of it. The police were involved and they tried to arrest me and not the chap who attacked me. So we have a culture, I think I also told you before, that the police seem to think and to act that if there's a possibility of a riot, they don't get involved, they don't make arrests of the people who are going to do the rioting. So it's always us that they remove because they know we will never riot, they know we're not violent. So knock-on effect, don't think so. There's going to have to be something bigger than that to get the parliamentarians to act on it. They seem to be more interested in Anna Soubry being called a Nazi than real Nazis attacking Jewish people. I think, Simon, that I was probably the first woman to be attacked on the streets of Europe since the last war, if I think back on it, to be physically attacked because she's a Jew.
What's been the psychological impact of this attack?
Huge. It's very difficult for me to talk about it.
I can imagine.
It's been a big psychological effect. It's kind of, it's not changed my resolve. It's not changed what I know is right. And it may sound arrogant, but I know that I'm right. Not right-wing, but right, correct. But it's changed how I feel. I think somebody who once had an accident and got a lot of skull damage told me how it changed the way she feels. And I think it's the kicking of the head that does that. It's made me feel very sorrowful, yeah. And I think it's going to take a long time to deal with that.
But, you know, you're showing bravery and you're showing courage coming on here today to talk about it because, you know, this is a warning not only to the Jewish community, but a warning to the nation and the state of our society and the fact that a woman such as yourself who's Jewish can actually be attacked for wanting to expose what was essentially a kind of hate-filled organisation and to expose what's going on, that you would actually face violence in return is something that is unacceptable because in politics it's about dialogue. Even if someone comes from an opposite opinion or a different ideology, it should never, ever result in violence.
It shouldn't be in violence. And there shouldn't be the sense that ringers are called out to attack people you disagree with. And if that does happen, the police should be there and make a case of it. They shouldn't be ignoring it. Now I have the police involved because my MP instigated that. So thank goodness I've got somebody that I can speak to. But this violence that takes place on our street is an indictment of our society. It's an indictment of I was reading an article about an event, something that happened in Canada, where the judge actually made a ruling that the law and the facts don't matter, that what matters is your feelings. And this is a huge issue here, that law is being sidelined for people's emotions, to promote emotions.
And is justice being done in any way? Are the police pursuing this
Police are
woman
now
who,
trying, but we're now, how many months afterwards are they going to be able to find these two girls to deal with it? I don't know.
So let's have a look at this disturbing video, which say that 40% of the British Jewish community are very concerned and alarmed at Jeremy Corbyn and could even consider leaving these shores.
A new poll shows that 40% of British Jews could leave the UK if Jeremy Corbyn became Prime Minister. The anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party just seems to be getting crazier by the day, doesn't it? Because if you might remember a while ago, the story was that Jeremy Corbyn was unable to control the anti-Semitism within his party. But now, he's the anti-Semite. I'm not saying that's not true. I don't think it's an exaggeration at all to call the man an anti-Semite, especially when you look at some of the people he's been willingly hanging out with very recently. But a poll has just been released by the Jewish Chronicle, which explains a huge rise in numbers of British Jews who say that they'd be willing or would consider leaving the UK if this man became Prime Minister. 40% of British Jews. Now, there's around 290,000 Jews estimated to be living in Britain, so that's more than 100,000 people. Just think about that. The Jewish Chronicle reported, British Jews between 35 and 54 are most concerned about the prospect of a Labour government under Mr Corbyn, with over half saying emigration is a serious consideration. And amongst Jewish women, fear of the impact of Mr Corbyn becoming PM is so great that over 44% say they would give serious thought to leaving the country. 51.77% of British Jews said they would not seriously consider leaving, with a further 9.7% saying they do not know. The results in the latest survey of British Jews carried out for the JC by polling company Survation support claims made by the former chief rabbi, Lord Sachs, at the weekend that the Labour leader is contributing to Jews openly questioning whether Britain is still a safe place to raise their children. It's funny, isn't it? A party that so often compares people to the Nazis if they dare talk about their concerns with immigration. They are, in fact, the party that are causing Jews to fear for their own lives, to fear for their own children, to fear for the future of their family. It's disgraceful that this is happening in 21st century Britain, and why has it come down to me to talk about it? I think it tells us exactly what we need to know about the Labour Party. It's the new nasty party. You might remember that phrase if you're into politics. And even after adopting, by the way, the Labour Party recently adopted that full definition of anti-Semitism that's accepted universally. Even after they finally adopted that, after much hoo-ha and arguing over it, by the way, they still got work to do. They still have work to do. They can try and patch over it by saying, okay, fine, we'll accept this definition that includes the suggestion that criticising viciously Israel is anti-Semitic. They finally accepted it, but that's not enough, is it? Because it's an understatement, I think, to say that this party has some issues with anti-Semitism. It's not so much work they need to do. You know, they do need to do some work now, and it's not work on perception of what they are, it's work on actually defining who they are, re-establishing that connection with the British people who are becoming increasingly worried by Labour, I think. Let's not forget the only reason the Tories are doing better than Labour is because UKIP's increasing in the polls a little bit. By no means is Labour a hugely popular party. But the Labour Party has to start kicking out the anti-Semites, and I think that includes Jeremy Corbyn. How are we meant to believe that this isn't an anti-Semitic party, by the way, when in the newest NEC elections, the Executive Council elections, people that have been entrenched in this anti-Semitic storm have been re-elected, and one person in particular is really worrying. She's called Yasmin Dar. She publicly declares her support for the Iranian Islamic Revolution. She celebrates the revolution every year at an event. We've seen videos that have come out about it recently. And let's not forget this Iranian revolution. You know, this is a political regime that considers Israel their greatest enemy, and they won't stop until they wipe it off the face of the earth. Make no mistake, Labour is a new nasty party, and it always has been. I don't think this is an issue of new people being anti-Semitic in Labour. I think they've always been there, and I think now they're coming out of the woodwork because they're being emboldened by people like Jeremy Corbyn and emboldened by Antifa and increasingly far left young people. Catch up with all the Rebel stories on our brand new app, which you can download now.
And what we saw from there was a good analysis about the problems of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. We're coming down towards the end of the programme now. Sharon, now what would you like to see Jeremy Corbyn do and the leadership of the Labour Party do to not only tackle this issue of Jew hatred that seems to absolutely dominate the party? There isn't a day go past where the issue of anti-Semitism is not on our national press, but also tackle this issue and then also bring reassurance to the Jewish community as well.
Okay, so you actually, I think, got the nail on the head. There isn't a day that goes by where there isn't something about anti-Semitism on the radio, on the television, in the newspapers. Anti-Semitism is now the topic of conversation at every dinner party. So, and none, if I'm allowed to use an expression. Okay, so the problem with this idea of talking about anti-Semitism creates a camouflage net for what goes on underneath it. I am not a person who believes in definitions. I don't believe in a definition of anti-Semitism. I always said that it was a pathway to a definition of Islamophobia. And now we have a definition of Islamophobia, which becomes a problem because to be a Muslim believing in Islam is not a race. So how do you make this definition? So you create something that says a feeling of Muslimness makes you an Islamophobic. So this is a big issue. So I'm not one in favor of definitions. This talk about anti-Semitism is just like my cup runneth over. It's too much. And what it's doing is allowing Corbyn particularly to hide what is really underneath it. Let's not forget, Corbyn remains a patron of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is the BDS. He remains a co-chair, I think, of CND. He remains involved with Stop the War Coalition. All of these groupings are racist. And I'm putting it in terms of racism, even though they believe that they're not fascists and they're not racist. All of them are racist endeavours, and Corbyn sits in the middle of them. There's nothing Corbyn can do to appease anti-Semitism. He may believe himself that he doesn't hate Jews, but he sits there, and he is the endeavour that facilitates it. The only solution is to get rid of Corbyn. Corbyn needs to be removed. We then left with the next tier of McDonnell and all the rest of them, who are probably the people who drive Corbyn. So the Labour Party is a problem in itself. The Labour Party needs to be disbanded. And I think what's happening now with the Brexit and the European elections that we don't want to be involved in, and the lack of government, there's a dissatisfaction with MPs from everywhere, with Parliament, with governance. And I think arising out of that will be hopefully some new parties, some new voices, people who can understand what the geopolitics of the world is. People who will not automatically decry President Trump because he's meant to be right-wing, but who will understand what he's doing, will understand what the dangers are of the problems in the world today, where this anti-Semitism comes from, why is there anti-Semitism, what is it about Jerusalem that makes it such a desirable place? Is it the geography, or is it the ideology that says that we have here an ideology that says we have the third and final prophet. If you don't accept him, we need to make you accept him. And that's the idea of wanting Jerusalem. It's not about geography. It's about getting rid of the Jews who will not succumb. They will not submit. And this is the problem. And for saying that, I am termed the racist because I want to be a Jew. That's really all I want to be.
And Sharon, you got an opportunity now. If you had a chance to speak to your viewers directly, in which you can, what message have you got for those that carried out, this particular woman that carried out this horrendous attack, and others could have stopped her from doing it?
I think the message is not to be not to be cowed into submission, not to give up what you believe in. If you believe in something, if you are informed, if you read, and you must read source material. You must not just read people's opinions, and it's very easy today to go to the newspapers and to get articles from all over the place, including the internet, and read opinions and be persuaded by them. You need source material, you need to read the Bible, you need to read the Quran, you need to read the Old Testament, the New Testament. You need to understand where we come from and what this conflict is about. And don't be coward. Don't give up because somebody is trying to stop you from speaking. Trust your message. If you know that your message is based on truth, on morality, and on ethical values for mankind, trust that. But don't deviate from that. That's the most important thing.
Sharon, I just want to thank you for showing bravery and for the courage that you took to come on and share with us all your hideous attack. And we just want to say that, you know, we stand with you, and you're not alone. And there are so many Christians out there that support you, and we want to see justice done so that something like this doesn't happen to another Jewish woman again, or anyone else that's Jewish. So thank you for the courage and the bravery you've shown.
Thank you, Simon, for inviting me and for your friendship. Thank you.
Pleasure. And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. Really what this interview demonstrates more than anything else is there is a fundamental problem wrong with the society today. And where we see the rise of Jew hatred, where we see an innocent Jewish lady attacked just for being Jewish, is not acceptable in our nation today. And that's why all of us can play a part wherever we see anti-Semitism in our society, whether it's people that we know, friends or others, making anti-Semitic comments, then we need to say that's unacceptable. And so by all of us doing this, we can stamp out the evil that is anti-Semitism. I'll leave you with this very moving tribute song sung by Ari Lesser about the Shoah, which was the ultimate anti-Semitic act committed by the Nazis nearly 80 years ago.
6 million Jewish lives were lost, murdered in the Holocaust. And yet online I find there's folks who claim that it's some kind of hoax. But I know the facts because I've met eyewitnesses who can't forget. And I wrote this song so the truth lives on long after the last survivor's gone. Nazi Germany had a fixation on attaining racial purification. They wanted a white bread Aryan nation, no place for Jews in their civilization. At first we just faced discrimination, intimidation, and humiliation, but there was a gradual escalation, and soon it was all out segregation. Without any warning or justification, they rounded up the Jewish population, locked us in ghettos with no sanitation and so little food we died of starvation. But that was before they began Operation Reinhard, which called for the liquidation of every Jew through mass deportation to facilities built for extermination. 6 million Jewish lives were lost, murdered in the Holocaust. And yet online I find there's folks who claim that it's some kind of hoax. But I know the facts because I've met eyewitnesses who can't forget. And I wrote this song so the truth lives on long after the last survivor's gone. We were directed to the nearest train station, sent from there straight to concentration camps. No idea that the situation would get much worse at our destination. They lined us up for examination. Those who were fit for an occupation worked as slaves with no compensation and so little food they died of starvation. Others were used for experimentation like sterilization through radiation, receiving unneeded operations, transplant, injections, and mutilations. But most went straight to extermination in gas chambers with no ventilation. The Zyklon B, upon inhalation, caused them internal asphyxiation. They clawed at the walls in desperation, but in the end there was no salvation. Thousands a day in the same location were gassed and then dragged out for cremation. 6 million Jewish lives were lost, murdered in the Holocaust. And yet online I find there's folks who claim that it's some kind of hoax. But I know the facts because I've met eyewitnesses who can't forget. And I wrote this song so the truth lives on long after the last survivor's gone. When the war finally reached its culmination and the camps were close to emancipation, the SS, in a last act of desperation, ordered a massive evacuation, marched us from location to location through miles of snow. snow. On the brink of starvation, thousands too weak to make the migration were shot en route to their destination. And when the few who survived the concentration camps finally received liberation, they still had no cause for celebration. Frail with disease and emaciation, they'd witnessed the total annihilation of the European Jewish population, a death toll beyond exact calculation. But we do have a pretty good estimation. 6 million Jewish lives were lost, murdered in the Holocaust. And yet online I find there's folks who claim that it's some kind of hoax. But I know the facts because I've met eyewitnesses who can't forget. And I wrote this song so the truth lives on long after the last survivor's gone.